Justice Beat is dedicated to the 1 in 3 Americans touched by incarceration. Justice Beat is where we discuss all things justice.
Good morning, Facebook family and friends. Glad to have you here with us this morning and for the 6th installment of season 2 of the Justice Youth Talk Show. We're glad to have you here this morning. I'm excited about our conversation this morning because it is truly a subject that's dear to my heart: education and the justice system, juvenile justice system. So I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Jackson Kelly, and he will get us started. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, Justice Youth family. Today we are honored to have Haley Korman with us here, who's a senior associate partner at Bellwether, an organization that focuses on improving education outcomes for students that are in the system. Her background includes legal advocacy, teaching experience, as well as a deep commitment to education equity. With that being said, Haley, welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Do you mind sharing with our audience a bit about your background and journey that led you to your current role here at Bellwether?
Yeah, so I have been doing some version of this kind of work for about 25 years now. I started my career as a classroom teacher. I was a teacher for 9 years. And then from teaching, I went on to law school here in Los Angeles. I then worked at a large law firm for a handful of years. I did some education, civil rights, impact litigation, excuse me, while I was there. Also, while I was there, I was in my personal life managing some of my family members coming into contact with the justice system, especially young people in and out of juvenile justice facilities. And I sort of reached my career transition point at the same time as my godson was awaiting trial here in Los Angeles. And my office at my fancy law firm downtown actually looked out over the men's central jail where he was being held. He was 19 at the time. He is now serving a 54-year term in a California state prison for a crime in which no one was hurt. The substantive sentence for the crime is 3 years. He also received a gang enhancement and a firearms enhancement, and then the judge imposed the sentences consecutively instead of concurrently. Sort of how that math happens. And so I was really thinking about, like, I am only going to get so many heartbeats in this lifetime, and how do I want to spend mine? And I transitioned to a very small nonprofit organization doing education support work in juvenile justice facilities, which really felt like sort of the right intersection of my personal experience, my experience as an educator, and my legal background. And so I spent a couple of years around the country in buildings, in classrooms, talking to kids, sitting and watching teachers. And I did some policy work, but it was sort of fingers in the dam. How do we make things a little bit better tomorrow? So I moved to Bellwether about 9 years ago for the opportunity to really speak to a larger audience. When we talk about juvenile justice education, or we might call it correctional education, it's not a new conversation. It's something folks have been talking about for a really long time, especially if you attended school in a secure facility or you know someone who has. But historically, it's been people talking to each other and not talking to, there's a much broader conversation around, excuse me, education reform. It's been going on for 30 years. Folks really thinking about how to better serve kids, especially those furthest from opportunity. But they're not talking to the people talking about correctional education, and the folks talking about correctional education really don't have space to learn from all of the lessons of the last 30 years of public education reform. To really see my role as trying to be a bridge in a lot of ways, to get stories out into the wider world and to get new knowledge in to those systems that are really coming into contact with young people and trying to best serve them. And when I think about sort of who I do my work for today, which is policy advising, it's research, it's writing, I think about someone I knew when I was a teacher. And he was a very good friend of mine, really like thoughtful, progressive educator. He taught high school. And when I first started doing this work, I was sharing with him what I was going to be doing. And he said, Haley, I have had students in my class who've gotten locked up. And they come back a couple months later. And I never once thought about the school where they were. Like, I knew they were gone. I knew they were locked up. Of course there's a school there. Never even for a second did I think about what that school is like, who those teachers are, what is the instructional quality, is there any accountability, is it none of it. And so he's really the person I have in mind when I do this work, that person who really is committed to the well-being of young people, especially our young people who are most vulnerable and for whom these systems are totally invisible. And by design, they're meant to be opaque, they're meant to be out of sight. But how do I make them more visible for the people who want to know more and want to do more?
Yeah, well, which is why we're especially happy to have you on here, so you can help shine a light on what those systems sort of look like for our viewers who may be a little less familiar with those types of systems. A common term that's kind of thrown around with regard to this sort of conversation that we're having is the school to prison pipeline. Do you mind explaining what that is for our viewers who may be unfamiliar with that?
Yeah, I think there are many different, all correct ways that people think about the school to prison pipeline. The way that I think about it at the highest level is that we have policies and practices baked into our sort of education systems that ensure that there really is only one very narrow path to success. And it's very easy to fall off that path. It is very easy to transgress in a way that, sort of triggers a cascade of consequences that can very quickly land a young person in contact with law enforcement. And that is not to say that there aren't things happening in schools and behaviors that need interventions, but the intervention that a young person needs is rarely a guy with a gun. It is, young people need emotional support. They need their basic needs met. They have unmet mental health needs. They have unmet, social and economic needs. And a police officer is not the tool to meet those needs, but it is often how schools view, their toolbox, their intervention. And once you introduce law enforcement into an interaction, the school loses control over what happens next. And I think we have seen over and over again in any example you might imagine, law enforcement will escalate a confrontation rather than de-escalate a confrontation. And it often ends with a kid in handcuffs, a kid in front of a judge. And once you then enter that system, it is very, very hard to return to sort of a normal adolescent trajectory.
Absolutely. And I think the presence of law enforcement within our school system has only maybe been reinforced over time, especially as we see an upward trend in incidents of things like school shootings happening. But I also definitely agree with your point in which how education is sort of painted as this sort of pathway out of things such as like conditions such as poverty. Whereas here in America, the educational disparities that exist sort of demonstrate that families with the most amount of needs maybe typically have the least amount of ability to sort of attain those resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that education certainly isn't the only thing we should focus on as we think about young people and families furthest from opportunity, as we think about communities that are destabilized. There are many, many things that people need and don't get enough of. And from where I sit, the work that I do, my little piece of the puzzle, for a lot of young people who that is their reality, they have no other cards to play. But if we can give them a high quality education experience, we give them one card to play. And that's something that can't be taken away from you. That's something you can't lose. That's something that can't be fined away. That can't, you get locked up, you've still got that. And it gives you access to all other kinds of learning, right? So if you've got the foundational skills, you then have some autonomy and independence about the direction in which you decide to take that. Again, that is not enough against all of the forces that are acting against a young person and a family, but it's better than nothing, and it is something we can do, and it's something I can do, and so I see that as one really essential piece of the puzzle, but it is certainly not it's not magic beans. It doesn't solve every problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely does that, unfortunately. Could you describe some of the key initiatives or projects that you've been involved with when it comes to system-involved students as part of Bellwether?
Yeah, so I would say it gets a little nerdy here, but one of the things I really think about when I think about why these systems are so poor quality and why they are allowed to continue to fail kids is because collectively, and not even expansively, like kind of publicly, but even within expert circles, we don't really know what's going on in them. And there's all kind of reasons for that. But 30 years ago, this is how we thought about sort of high poverty urban and rural schools. Oh, wow, things are really tough. Those kids have it rough and the teachers are trying hard. And what do you really expect them to do? Because we didn't actually have any information about what was happening. We didn't have information about where things were, like who was doing well, who was succeeding and why, and how could we replicate that? We just kind of thought like, oh, it's a really good teacher, great. And we don't tolerate that anymore. We have an expectation that we're going to have at least a baseline level of knowledge about whether kids are learning and where kids are doing really well. How are we sort of using that data as a flashlight to understand what we can do more of? How are they being so sick? What is the secret here? And also thinking about like where kids continue to be failed. Like we can't tolerate that. We can't say like, oh, well, what are they supposed to do? Because that's not true, right? Some folks are really able to demonstrate a lot of success. So a lot of the work that I do has to do with really understanding how these systems are designed and built. I'm a policy analyst, sort of first and foremost, and so really thinking about the policy structures within them. But a lot of that is like, how are we collecting data? And again, that sounds like dull and boring, but if I've got a building full of kids that I'm supposed to be serving and I don't know what they need, right? How am I supposed to be tailoring instruction to meet their needs? And then how am I supposed to know if I did anything useful at all if I'm not measuring like whether or not they've learned anything? And there are many different ways we can do that. There are many different challenges to doing that. But part of the reason these systems are sort of allowed to operate as ineffectively as they are is because they're basically off the books. It's not even that we're like not analyzing the data thoughtfully or we're not asking the right questions. We don't even collect the data. We have no idea. And you walk into a building in most places and ask people like, how many of your students here are reading at grade level? And most people wouldn't be able to tell you the answer. They couldn't find the answer. You can't look up the answer. We don't know. Probably very few of them, but we don't actually like, I can tell you all of these things. A school leader can tell you all these things. I'm also going to tell you, like, I don't think you should take my word for it. I should be able to show you exactly what we're doing well and what we're not, and where we need to put more resources and where we need to sort of intervene and where we see success, right? What are the really strong programs that we should be thinking about how to replicate? What can we learn from them? What can we do more of? So my work is really focused on helping. Right now, the like foundational question is like, what is going on? Right? And how do we solve a problem we can't even yet name? I will say, kind of in parallel with that, while we are doing all this work and all this research and thinking about kind of instructional practices, thinking about improving the quality of education services in these buildings for the kids who are in them, I hold that simultaneously with a belief grounded in both like values, but also evidence and expertise that these are not healthy places for children to learn. There is not a way to design a school for kids who are confined that is going to provide them with the same healthy education opportunity that they would have if they were in a community-based setting. It is antithetical to just understanding the adolescence and human learning, to think that folks can be in this sort of punitive environment, deprived of their liberty, removed from their communities, and out of contact with their sort of most supportive people in their lives, and then like learn how to multiply fractions. It is fundamentally by design. These are not places that can become really high quality learning environments. But that doesn't mean we say like, so we're not going to do this work, right? There are kids in the buildings today. How do we best serve them? How do we make that as high quality as it can be? Because while I am encouraged by reductions in numbers of incarcerated youth population that we have seen over the last 10 or 15 years, we're not down to zero. I don't think we're going to get to zero in my lifetime. And I also recognize that there are some young people who are not prepared to navigate through the world unsupervised. And that's an important element of doing this work well, is acknowledging that there are some young people who engage in harmful, destructive behaviors. I don't think locking them in cages is the answer, but this is not, there's a very real sort of public safety element to this that I think in order to do the work successfully, we have to be clear-eyed about.
Yeah, and even if it is an answer, it certainly isn't one of the more humane options available by far. And I really like what you're saying, because I think it's shining a light on where the gaps sort of exist between public perception and the reality of, sort of communities that are underserved, and especially when it comes to these educational settings. Because, since there is no data collected, although it's, maybe not the most interesting or entertaining process itself, it is very important, because when no data is collected, it sort of gives way to sort of stereotypes to be like maintained over time. And it, maybe allows us to give maybe teachers the benefit of the doubt where, that may not always be the case.
No, I think that's true. And I think that, it can be, it's a like intellectually and sometimes morally complex area to work in, because especially in states where we are seeing a real push towards diversion programs so that younger first-time nonviolent offenders are much less likely to end up serving a sentence in a secure facility. You're often working with a population, they've committed real crimes with real victims. And it is not for the teacher to then punish them with a low quality education experience. But you do have to wrestle with some of the kind of politics around that, and the idea of like, well, I've got all these kids over here who didn't do a bad thing. Why should I be investing in these kids over here? And I think the reality of that is that I've never talked to a kid in a juvenile justice facility who said like, oh, this is the only bad thing that ever happened to me, right? Nobody's first experience with violence is as a perpetrator. And this is a population of young people who are, it's the deep end, right? This is the culmination of years and years and years of failures of adults in their lives. And it is, they're the proverbial like canaries in the coal mine, right? This is as bad as it gets, short of dying, is that kids end up in these spaces. And right now we sort of look at them as they have made the mistakes, they've failed, they've made the bad choices, when the reality is they are the result of mistakes and bad choices of systems and adults in their lives. And one of the things that I find especially sort of heartbreaking when I talk to young people heartwarming, is how much responsibility many of them take for their choices and how little they hold the adults responsible for the choices that they made. You mentioned earlier in the conversation thinking about school shootings, and we're really seeing kind of hardening of schools and increases in law enforcement present on school campuses because of school shootings. And we don't often sort of stop and ask, like, where did that kid get a gun? Right? What is the role of like easy access to firearms in this equation? Because once upon a time, that kid was just as angry and just as alienated, and he was going to come to school and like punch some people. And the school principal knows how to deal with that, right? That's a manageable, like, adolescent incident that we can handle. And it is the introduction of firearms that makes that feel like an adult problem, not a kid problem. But the kid hasn't changed, right? It is the easy access to firearms. And how did that happen? And whose failure is that? Because it's not the 15-year-old. It's a much different conversation. But I just think that there are choices that adults have made that they get to be immunized from being accountable for. And it's often not an individual adult. Sometimes it is. But the young person is very much expected to be sort of accountable, remorseful, take responsibility for the choices they made when sometimes they had only bad choices, or no one was there to help them access what we adults would say is the better choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you bring up an excellent point, and it reminds me of personally of reasons why I'm so very happy to be working in the mental health field and being a future practitioner. Currently, I work with children diagnosed on the autism spectrum, and part of my work involves teaching and coping skills so that they have outlets to use, and while that does sort of acknowledge the personal responsibility piece, we also at times work with families and teach them, hey, in this setting, you may be reinforcing certain behaviors by doing this. So it's important to acknowledge that and try to sort of reframe how we address this sort of behavior and these challenging behaviors.
Yeah, I think there's, the other piece of this that is, you've got to hold both truths simultaneously, is that, I believe that adults care for their children and communities care for their young people and want them to live good lives in a good world. And not every parent and not every adult treats their children well. And both of those things are true. And we are sometimes so I will talk to some young people who being in a secure facility is a relief to them. They feel safe. They are protected. Where they are coming from was not, they felt in danger. And again, it's like heartwarming and heartbreaking, right? And I'm so grateful that you have found a place where you feel that relief. And I can't believe this is it, right? It took this for you to get that. Nobody saw what was happening. Nobody intervened. Nobody protected you. And now we're here. And the consequences of that for young people over a lifetime are going to, you can build a good life out of that, but you don't recover from it, right? It is just a bad thing that has happened to you. It's never going to be okay. You're never going to I am not of the mind of like, it builds character and you're stronger because of it and you're so grateful for it. Like it's just a bad thing that happens. And the best you can do is find those like lessons in it. But it's not a good thing. It's not a positive place for a young person to be. We can give them all of the good they experience in much better ways.
Absolutely right. You can't change the past, but you, irregardless, have to try to find some semblance you can to work for a better future, which is a great transition into our next question here. When it comes to advocating for reforms and addressing institutional obstacles in providing a high quality education services to youth in institutional settings, what is your approach when it comes to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have my ambitions. What would I do if I were in charge? But we typically work and that's what I'll do when I do like field-facing research and writing, talk about what the evidence tells us. But a lot of the work that I do is in partnership with a client who is often a direct service organization or a public agency. And so we are working with them, and we can say like, here's what it should be, but they have to start from what it is. And they have to be thinking through all of the questions about like what's politically feasible, what do we have resources for, what can we actually implement, how do we actually sustain this over time. And so that can look very different in different places. And what I try to do in those client engagements is just to help people feel energized about the possibility, find sort of collaboration with one another, and build that kind of forward. There's like the policy work on paper that we do of like, instead of doing it this way, do it this way, change your procedures, change this, change that. Parallel to that is the relational work of helping all of those people in that place understand this is a really sort of long runway that they've got to, we're at the start of, and we can kind of help you moving. But as consultants, like, we leave at the end of the contract, and what we need is to have a community of people who are in relationship to one another and who feel committed to the work moving forward. It also just looks very different in different places, serving different people who may hold different values. There are some places that have young people held in like very large kind of congregate care facilities, 100, 200, 300 kids. There are other places that really prioritize much smaller placements where they've got fewer than 10 kids together. So reforming systems looks quite different. If you've got 300 kids, you probably have half a dozen teachers, you've got a math teacher, you've got a reading teacher. If you have 6 kids, it's one room schoolhouse style. And so you've got to figure out like what does that mean for delivering like high quality education services? There are also differences between short-term and long-term facilities. And short-term and long-term I use to describe the sort of design of the facility, the intention of the facility. In short-term facilities, they are meant for young people kind of pre-adjudication. So you've been arrested, it's before you have been adjudicated and kind of received a placement. But some young people stay in what's termed a short-term facility for several months and sometimes even years, based on the nature of their case and what they might be sort of contesting with the courts. And so, but a short-term facility is often serving young people for weeks at a time. You'll come in on any given day. You could leave 2 days later, 2 weeks later, 2 months later. We don't know. The teacher doesn't know. You don't know. The judge doesn't know. And then a long-term facility is in a very different environment because they typically, they're still receiving and losing kids sort of day over day. But usually when a kid arrives, I know that they'll be here 6 months or 2 years, and I can plan instruction accordingly. So that's also has a lot of variation. But I really see myself as kind of the critical friend and the nudge and sort of a holder of a vision, while also being pragmatic and being practical about what can we do in the next 6 months or the next year or the next 18 months that is going to help you all move this forward and then sustain it over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And in your experience when working with these individuals, what are you noticing are some of the maybe most significant challenges faced by those students in accessing that quality education maybe in the first place?
In the first place, do you mean before they come to the facility?
I would say maybe before and after, and maybe while in the facility.
Yeah, I would say one is it's under-researched, but I have a hypothesis just from talking to young people. that for the most part, experiences with academic failure are often the thing that tip a kid into the kind of behavior that brings them into contact with law enforcement. That if I am struggling with the content of my classwork and I'm not getting the help that I need, right, it is much easier to get kicked out of class than to be asked to read out loud. And if I can get suspended, even better. Right? And that sort of early misbehavior is often perceived as like, well, it's because you're playing around that you aren't keeping up with the work, when in fact it's the causal relationship runs the other way. I can't do the work, and so I play around. Excuse me. Because I want to distract you, and I want to get out of this situation. And so I think it's those like really early experiences with school failure that begin to set kids up for the school to prison pipeline. Then we respond to it by sending you to the principal's office. We said, oh, here's the school resource officer. Here's, he won't stop talking. Can you get him out of my classroom? And so I think like there's a really like primary intervention very early, and this sort of updating of orientation in our schools. We are seeing that early misbehavior, right? To be open to the possibility that it is because there's an academic intervention that kid needs and is not getting. And so I think that's one piece of it. When I talk to young people in facilities, one of the questions I always ask is, when is the last time you remember going to school every day? And the answer is usually 5th or 6th grade. And so kids they've not been attending school. They've got gaps of 3, 4, 5 years by the time they're even in the building. You get tremendous skill gaps. I think one of the policy challenges that we've got to reckon with is that we work in an ecosystem where the rules demand, with good reason, that kids in secure facilities are receiving grade level instruction. So if you are in 10th grade, we're in whatever state we're in, we're supposed to be reading The Grapes of Wrath. That is one of the books in our 10th grade state standards. The problem is my 10th graders can't read. Right? And no matter how many times we read through The Grapes of Wrath, because we're supposed to be talking about, theme and tone, I'm not helping them if I'm not teaching them how to read. Right? And so we've got this real friction between wanting to hold these schools and these students to the same high expectations as their peers in a sort of traditional neighborhood school, with what educators recognize sort of of like meeting a kid where they are, right? And if you are at a 2nd grade level as a 10th grader, I want to get you there. I want you to be achieving at that 10th grade level, but we got to get through 3rd grade and 5th grade and 7th grade first. And we do not currently have sort of a policy and accountability design that makes that possible. And so teachers are trying to teach like a literacy lesson, like a reading lesson while reading like The Grapes of Wrath, which just fundamentally doesn't work for a kid who doesn't have basic reading skills, basic literacy. And so I think we've got this real mismatch between understanding how we actually meet the real needs of the kids in front of us, while still holding a value of wanting them to achieve at the same levels as our community-based peers. And you talk to any educator, he's not been in school since 5th grade. He's incredible skill gaps when it comes to basic reading and math skills, can't do basic arithmetic. But I've got him in an Algebra 1 class, and he's trying to earn Algebra 1. Like, nobody thinks that's going to work. And yet we keep doing it because we've not designed systems with these kids truly in mind and thinking about what will actually lead to their success.
And when it comes to sort of how you navigate sort of the legal and political complexities that are associated with those changes when advocating for these reforms. What I imagine you have a myriad of lenses that your background offers you when it comes to that sort of process. And so what does that process look like for you when you're trying to understand it?
Yeah. I think the thing that is most important to how I do the work is I am committed to approaching it from an orientation that always begins with a young person and a young person's experience and a young person's unmet needs. And the primacy of that in thinking about, if I am working with a client in a specific place trying to solve a specific problem, we begin like, what problem are we trying to solve for whom? What problem are young people experiencing in this? What is their unmet need? And then how do we work back from there to understand what meets that need? And then how do we design the system or the policies to make that possible, right? What would either facilitate or inhibit meeting that need? And what are then the implications for sort of the adults at the whiteboard to figure out, rather than going in the other direction, right? Of like, well, what are the laws and how do we change them? And how, beginning from the piece of paper, but really thinking about, well, what does this young person need? How do they articulate what they need? I am also mindful, like I think that this is true. Like teenagers are not great narrators of what they actually need, but they have a lot of confidence in talking about what they need. And I think we want to respect that, right? Like there is a lot of value in people articulating their unmet needs. Also, I talked to a young person once who said, the thing I really need is I'm in foster care. I'm supposed to be getting a bus pass every month. It's always late. And I can't get to school for like the first week of the month because I don't have my bus pass. And if I could just get that bus pass on time. And then the more we talked, so for him, he was like, I need the bus pass. Can someone just get me the bus pass? And the more I talked to him, the more it became revealed he was like moving foster care placements every 8 weeks. And that's why the bus pass wasn't getting to him, because it was getting forwarded and they didn't have a new address and this and that. I was like, oh, that's the problem, right? The bus pass is the symptom. It can't find its way to you. The problem is that you are moving placements far too much. But for him, that was such a normal part of his existence. It did not occur to him that that might be a thing he could complain about, right? That's just how the world operates. What I need is my bus pass. So I think there's a role for us as adults and professionals to always listen for the thing kind of not being said, or what a young person, where their sort of visibility ends because their experience is limited, or because they just have always lived in a state of being controlled, of being told this. It seems futile to try to say, but what if I didn't move placements every 8 weeks? Like, obviously that would be better. And I'm sure he said that 100 times and everyone said, like, not possible. Please stop complaining about that. And so I really always begin from the point of view of the young person. And sometimes that means like we make decisions about a policy change that's like harder for adults, but makes life better for kids. And getting the people in the room, the professionals in the room, to a place where they are comfortable with that, where they will say, like, I understand that this makes my job harder and I'm going to have to train my people differently, but it is such high impact for young people. And that is actually what we are here to do, that we're going to do it. And so bringing people around to that orientation where they can kind of take off their agency hat and say, like, we're thinking about a young person over the course of a lifetime, not just like my job, what I do, here's what we offer, here's how you're eligible, here's the form to fill out. Like, what does this young person need and what does this family need?
Yeah, absolutely. And in your sort of description of maybe like younger people not being the best narrators, or maybe not even necessarily having the experience to know what it is exactly that they might need, I'm kind of just reminded of Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye, and sort of just the stream of consciousness sort of narration. So I thought that was just funny because I that was the first thing that came to my mind. But you're absolutely right in that, because these young people don't have that experience, they don't necessarily know what else there is, like what their options are. And so I think that definitely plays a big role in how they sort of shape and develop their own goals, even if that might take the shape of in like an unconscious process. I'm also curious to hear about some of your success stories in working with clients, both at Bellwether, maybe even beforehand. I know there was a pretty big court case that you had worked on previously while you were an attorney, Reed versus, what is it? Reed versus, if you could
Reed versus State of California. Yep.
Yes, that's the one. Mhm.
Yep. Yeah, that was sort of long before I was doing this work. Reed was, so we brought this case, it was plaintiff's counsel along with the ACLU and public counsel. And the case was, we were suing the school district on behalf of students in Los Angeles middle schools that had seen teacher layoffs in the amount of like 50, 60, 70% of their teachers in 2 years in a row. And the sort of premise of the case, we know that as teachers gain seniority, they migrate to higher achieving, wealthier, whiter schools, well documented. So then lower achieving, less white, higher poverty schools are where your brand new teachers get slotted in as the district is hiring. So when you do a reverse seniority layoff, well, where are all those new teachers? Right? They're really concentrated in some of your highest need schools. And so we brought suit on behalf of the families to try to stop the district laying off teachers at some of those most impacted schools. It was probably about 3 years on that case, went all the way up to the California Supreme Court. Didn't really... I think it resulted in a win. We had a settlement agreement with the district and with the union. It ended up being procedurally quite complex. And then by the time we were sort of signing off on a settlement agreement, the risk of layoffs had passed. And so the court ended up not really ruling on the underlying sort of legal question there. It was very interesting. It was very interesting to me to see sort of the role of litigation and impact litigation as we think about kind of education civil rights work, what it can do and what it can't do. Victories broadly in this work are, I don't want to say they're few and far between, but you've got to sell. It is, to do this kind of work, you have to become comfortable with incremental wins. And to recognize it is one small piece of a much bigger and longer struggle, and that we can only do what we can, but we can do what we can. And so being able to support leaders across the country to change their orientation and begin to make some policy changes and some shifts in the way that they think about education services for young people in custody, getting some like legislative and policy wins. I would say, like, having now done this work specific to education in secure facilities for about a dozen years now, the biggest win for me that I see is that like way more people are talking about this than were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, this was like a fringe niche issue. I had to like start at the ground floor explaining to people what it was and why it matters. And I feel so encouraged when I see people like writing stuff out in the world or doing work like this podcast, or it's people are doing the work and also the world is welcoming them and meeting them, right? So both things are happening. And I see my sort of effort from where I sit much more in kind of the second side of that is like priming the kind of broader education reform community to understand that this is a problem you need to care about. These are students who matter, and like creating space for all of the people who have been saying this for many, many years, but giving them a place in the room. I was at I moderated a panel a few weeks ago that was focused around like student disengagement. And two of the folks on that panel worked with young people who were in the juvenile justice system. And then we had the district superintendent there. And that's not a panel we would have had 6 years ago. And we wouldn't have brought in folks who are running juvenile justice facilities to talk about kind of what they are seeing and experiencing and what they think the implications are for school districts as they think about student re-engagement and chronic absenteeism. And so, like, to me, it's hard to measure, but that broader cultural shift around, you have understanding for, education reform folks in all sorts of forms. But when you talk about education equity and you want to say, like, all students and students furthest from opportunity, that's these kids. And I don't tolerate folks being like, oh, well, somebody else is going to figure that out. They'll go to alternative schools. They'll go, okay, and now what, right? How do we think about how we make those environments high quality? How do we think of that? One of the things that really sparked me to sort of go in this direction, 20 years ago, I was reading an interview with a charter school leader who had led some high-profile school turnarounds, one of them in LA Unified, the big high school. And there was an interview with him, and someone was like, how did you make these changes? What were some of the first things you did? And he said, oh, one of the very first things I did was got rid of all the gang members. I was like, okay, those are your students. Like, how is it that you have this belief that you can simply sort of abdicate responsibility for some group of students learning because they're hard for you to teach? And it's really building in people resilience that you should be on the hook for teaching kids, even if it's hard for you. Even if they don't like you, even if you don't like them, that doesn't mean you don't have to teach them. And that they can just sort of, once they've exited your school doors, that's no longer your responsibility, but that we do hold a shared responsibility for their learning.
Absolutely, yeah. Just because it's difficult, doesn't mean that the work isn't still important or that it needs to be done. Absolutely, for sure. I think we're going to start to kick off our Q&A segment now, where our viewers will have the opportunity to ask you questions based on our conversation and based on your expertise. So our first question from our viewers is, what advice do you have for educators, lawyers, and policymakers to help develop a trauma-informed lens to best serve individuals in child-serving systems?
Yeah, it is, I think, I experience some of, I feel least confident when I'm working directly with young people, because I am so mindful that what every person needs is very different. And I want to be very careful, especially in the work that I do. I am often, if I'm talking to a young person, I'm never going to see them again. And so I try to be very honest and direct and forthcoming about sort of my understanding of that reality, right? And that this is a young person who's probably had a dozen white ladies walk into your house and I ask you, they tell me about the worst day of your life, and then you never see them again. So I think it starts with that kind of knowledge of self and self-awareness and kind of who you are and how you are entering a conversation. And that young person does not care about how much I care, what my personal experience is, or what, and in that dynamic, my feelings don't matter. Right? That's not the point. That's not what we're doing here. And some young people have been desperate for someone to listen. They want to talk, they want to tell, they are so eager to have that listening ear, especially if it is someone who like has some power. And I will tell them, like, I'm trying to learn these things so that we can give good advice, like change things for the better for you and for other kids like you. And some kids are really eager for that, and that feels reinforcing for them and important for them. There are some kids who are like, I don't want to do that. Like, this feels extractive. Why should I be telling you about, the hardest things in my life? I don't even know you. You're not here to help me. Nothing's going to get better about my life tomorrow because I talk to you. And that's okay too. Right? And being like very attuned to the interaction and the moment. I think of myself a little bit, it goes back to the part of the conversation earlier, right? Like, it's like a little bit of a translator. The language of experience is so valuable, but it's very different from the language of policy. And so I see my roles in a lot of ways as like receiving the language of experience and being able to translate that into the language of policy. Not asking a young person, like, how should we change this state law about data sharing, right? But tell me what it was that was hard for you when you went to re-enroll in school and they didn't have your transcripts, right? And then it is my job as the professional to like take that and be able to turn that into, okay, what do we need to do? What changes from a policy perspective to solve the problems that young people are having? I think it is just it's a humility. It's a recognition. One of the things I talk to people a lot about is, even with my own personal experiences, the experience of people in my family, I live a very different life than a young person who is incarcerated. We all do, right? By nature of not being incarcerated. Even professionals who are in buildings every single day, they go home at night, right? They sleep in their own beds. And I really push people I work with to hold that true. And as much as we might think that we know what's best and we can sort of, I know what kids think, I know what kids want, we still have to talk to kids. We still have to understand directly from them, what are they experiencing? How do they perceive the problem? And that might not be the like full picture, because again, there are some things like they don't perceive or they can't describe. But we do need to hear it from them. We do need to know, and sometimes our parents are not the best sort of filters for that either. And that if you're trying to solve a problem for people, you need to talk to the people who are having the problem. Not just to understand how they experience the problem, they often have really good ideas for solutions. And that can provide a lot of inspiration for they're like, oh yeah, no, I do this instead. And we're like, oh, we should just make that the rule. Because that's what everybody's doing, and that's the easy thing, and that solves the problem. And let's just resource that and support that and train people in that. But I think for me, when I think about a trauma-informed lens, I think about the idea of, people use the analogy of like universal progressions, that you just go into every interaction with holding open the possibility the person you are talking to has experienced the worst things a person can experience. And that matters even if you yourself have experienced terrible things. It's not a competition. Nobody wins when we try to pit those things against each other. And being having the humility and being open to the possibility that this person you are not what they want or need. And especially this population of young people live their lives under so much coercion and enforcement, and they are required to be here. They're required to talk to these people. They're required, and sometimes they're required to talk to me. And I can't do anything about that dynamic, but what I can do is try to make the relationship and the conversation feel as liberating is too strong a word, but to give them as much kind of space and freedom to decide what we talk about, how we talk about it, when they don't want to talk about something or when they want the conversation to be over, as I can, because that is a thing I can do.
Excellent. And then I think we have maybe time for one last question before we begin to wrap up. What would you say about the influx and plethora of monies, political backroom deals, backing special interests in the education equity space, getting in the way of work on behalf of youth?
Yeah, and it's a it's a complicated question. We probably don't have time to answer all the way sort of to the end of it today. I guess I would say I think there is somebody could describe any one of us as having like special interests, right? And because we are not the young people experiencing the problems. We are not the one, I think that for the most part, everybody working in education equity holds a genuine belief that the things that they are doing are good for young people. They may have different values than I do about like the best ways to achieve that, or the risks being created, or sort of which young people sort of take priority and ought to receive resources. But I do believe that everyone sort of deep in their heart of hearts, like thinks they're doing something good for young people, for communities. Again, they may hold different communities closer to their hearts than I do, or think differently about short and long-term consequences. But it's very hard to find like genuinely sort of nefarious intent. I think even when I go into like a juvenile justice facility and I talk to the custodial staff, far more often than not, 99 times out of 100, people think they're doing right by kids, right? They will say like, growing up, like I needed a heavy hand. That's what really got me back on track. And I'm going to do that for these kids who the boot camp style, like that's actually that's going to be good for them. I think the research tells us it's not good for kids, but people believe it. They think they are doing right by kids. There are very few like genuine sadists in these places. There are some, but people think they're doing a good thing. And so one of the things I think a lot about is we talk a lot about disagreement. It comes from this book. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the author. It's about productive disagreement, and he kind of categorizes disagreements in 3 ways around what is true, what is meaningful, and what is useful. And what is true is like, what are the facts? Are kids achieving at grade level? Are kids, all of that. There's what's meaningful. What do I value? That comes from my experience. That comes from my perspective. It comes from my identity. What do I think is important? And then there's what's useful. What do I think is actually going to fix things? How do I actually improve things? And most of the people I work with, we kind of agree on what's true, right? That's valid data, that's a good measure, that's something we can rely on, including when we bring in the lived experience of young people. I don't get into a lot of debates about whether or not like a person actually had that experience or whether or not that was actually a bad experience. We can really differ on what is meaningful and what we care about. When I see that happening, I try to move us to what is useful, right? So if we agree on what is true and we want it to, and we hold the same vision for the future, we don't actually have to agree on like, who's the bad actor here, or why did this happen, or are people racist, or what. I know what I believe. I'm very confident in what I believe, and I don't spend a lot of time debating that with people because it's not worthwhile. It's also often very unlikely to change. So we move to what's useful. Like okay, we're not going to agree on that. Let's talk about what's actually going to make this better. And that's often where we can get to a place of productivity and really thinking about how we make improvements and how we make changes, centering, again, like what are the unmet needs of that young person, and sort of circumventing a lot of the like, why did we come to this space? Why do I do this work? What do I value? What do I think is meaningful? Because I know for myself, like no one's going to talk me out of my values. So I'm probably not going to talk somebody else out of theirs. And so I think there are always in every kind of space and industry, and even in like some of the like more progressive circles where I spend time with people, it's just sort of like my social community, there's a lot of disagreement about how we get there and why, and our values and our perspectives and our beliefs. And so that's where I try to put my energy. I will say, like, I think I'm not sure I'd call it like a special interest, but this is a population of kids who, like, they're not a sympathetic student population. If we're being realistic, they don't have a lot of advocates. They don't have champions. There's not a lot of resources to do this work. There isn't a lot of resourcing at the like public level. There's also like not a lot of philanthropy, right? They're like, ooh, no thanks. I'd rather put resources to kids that I can publish like smiling faces in an annual report. And to me, that's much less like sort of an issue of special interest and much more just like a human failure. And the ways in which we like short-term wins and we like to be able to feel gratified in our work, that leaves us really reluctant to tackle hard problems that we don't actually know how to solve.
That's a great response, and I could not agree more. I just wanted to give you an opportunity as we wrap up here, just to share with our viewers, if there are any current projects, publications, or books that our viewers could follow up on, or that you're working on that our viewers can look out for.
Yeah, I don't have anything coming out in the near term that I think would be of interest, but I would recommend we published an analysis if folks are interested in the sort of getting deep in the policy weeds on this, called Double Punished, Locked Out of Opportunity. And it's a 50 plus state scan, so it includes DC and Puerto Rico, looking at the governance, finance, and accountability policies in every state for their juvenile justice education programs. So governance has to do with like who runs the program. Is it the state? Is it the school district? Is it a private contractor? Finance has to do with how budget decisions are made. Not just where does the money come from, but who gets to decide how to spend it. And then accountability has to do with sort of who's responsible when things don't go well, when students aren't achieving, and how do we even know if they are or aren't achieving? And I will, spoiler alert, reveal one of the big finding is that there aren't really any states that have a coherent policy design. Right? In a functioning education system, your governance, finance, and accountability policies line up with each other. It seems intuitive, it's obvious, right? The people who are making decisions about how money is spent should be the people held accountable for whether kids are learning. And they should be the ones with authority to actually do things differently. In most juvenile justice education programs in most states, that's not true. People who are making, double punished, locked out of opportunity, and it's on our website. But in most states, there are like 2 or 3 or more different agencies responsible for different pieces of decision making. So the governance agency who is responsible for like how the school is run might not have any authority about how money is spent. They can't make any budgeting decisions. And they might not be held accountable for whether or not the school is run effectively. Or they might be held accountable, but they don't get to make decisions. And I've had folks after that publication came out say like, okay, well, what is the right policy design? What's the right governance model? I don't know. We don't know because we don't have any if you want to know what works, what I care about is student outcomes, right? Where are kids actually learning? And if we don't have that fundamental, like basic data, I can't tell you what works. I can tell you what I think works. I can tell you what like my hypothesis is, what my instinct is, because I've been in a lot of these places, but I don't think you should take my word for it. I don't think anybody should. I think we should be able to look at what is true, not just what Haley thinks is true. And folks should be able to draw their own conclusions. And right now we just don't have the evidence for that. We don't have student outcome data. And like I said, we don't collect it. And there are a lot of complicated technical reasons for that that have to do with like assessment design. And some of that is whether we have the resources. I think it's a solvable problem. I think with resources and effort, we could develop better assessment strategies. But some of it is like a psychometric problem, and that there are statistical challenges with like measuring growth for a kid over a span of 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, and whether or not that's even reliable data. And so it's a complicated problem to solve. It's incredibly technically challenging. This is a very sophisticated problem to solve. And so far, we are not treating these questions with the level of sophistication that they deserve.
All right. Well, I believe that will wrap up our conversation for today. Haley Korman, thank you so much for being with us and offering such wonderful insights. I definitely learned a lot, and I think I'll be looking at this recording a lot later because you just kept making point after point after point. And I don't know if I was able to keep up with everything, honestly. So absolutely wonderful insights. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
The Justice Beat. If you like what you heard and found the information useful, then support the Justice Beat radio show by spreading the word and telling a friend.